Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Keeping Relevant. My guest today is Beatrice Weber. She's the executive director of YAFFED, a nonprofit whose mission is to improve the quality of education in New York's Hasidic yeshivas. And welcome.
Good to be here.
It's very complicated, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. You know why it's complicated? I think one of the reasons is that I don't really understand the communities and the community you come from. So I'm just looking at it from the point of view of a decent education. I don't understand what people really think and how they really live in it. And I think that would be a great help if you could explain a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I think that perspective of viewing it as children who deserve an education is just very simple.
Yeah, that is simple.
Like New Yorkers, I think we can all agree on that. All New York children deserve to get an education. And unfortunately, there are tens of thousands of children who are not
You
right
know,
now.
I looked it up, but every child in this country is supposed to have an education. It doesn't necessarily spell what the curriculum should be, but people can get arrested for neglect if their children aren't in school. And it's assumed, I guess, that they're getting a good education.
And New York State pretty much lays it out. You know, they do give a lot of clarity in terms of what actually needs to be taught. Not in terms of the curriculum or number of hours, but in terms of there needs to be a certain number of subjects. There needs to show that they're moving from grade to grade, like some standards for hiring. But unfortunately, none of that is being met in many of the schools that we work with. And I'm happy to kind of explain, you know, where this community fits into the larger world of New Yorkers, the larger world of the Jewish community, because I think this is a pretty insular community that many of us don't interact with on a daily basis, and sometimes, you know, hard to understand where they fit into the picture. So there's a large Jewish community in New York, right, as we all know, which is wonderful, and a percentage of that Jewish community would fit into what's called the Orthodox world. Okay, so the Orthodox, world believes in the, traditional way of interpreting the Jewish laws, and in that Orthodox world, you have a number of different groups. So you have the modern Orthodox world, who the education there, for the most part, is really on a very high standard, above your standard public school.
Like Ramaz.
Exactly. So those are yeshivas too, but those standards are really high. Many of those students end up going to Ivy League schools, and you have those across the city, in all the boroughs. Those are Orthodox schools.
Right. It's interesting. And are they called yeshivas?
Some of them are.
Yeah.
You have Yeshiva Flatbush, which is also a very high standard school. In the modern Orthodox, this problem does not exist. On the contrary, the education level for both the Judaic studies, which they do in the morning, and the secular studies, which they generally do in the afternoon, is really high. Then you also have, in that Orthodox world, you have what's called the Haredi community. Okay? So in the Haredi community, you have a couple of buckets. You have the Hasidic community. And in the Hasidic community, you have the Hasidic community that would belong to a community like Williamsburg, Borough Park, where you have a lot of the more Hungarian, Polish Hasidim. You also have the Chabad community, which is a little bit different. But in New York City, all of those institutions, for the most part, the vast majority of those yeshivas have an education that is subpar. Under the Haredi umbrella, you also have what's called the Yeshivish or Litvish community. In that community, we estimate it's about half and half, with half of those schools, giving the children a substantially equivalent education, and half of them really not, and very similar to what's going on in the Hasidic community. And we've seen over the years that it's gotten worse in that, yeshivish community. There are tens of thousands, really, and that is, we believe, an underestimate number of children who are in these kinds of schools. Now,
what's the curriculum in those schools?
Yeah, so I described a little bit what it looks like in some of the modern Orthodox schools where those children are graduating with the ability to go to Ivy League schools. What we have in contrast in many of the Hasidic communities, including the one my youngest son attends, is where they have very long days, right? So those days start about 8:30 in the morning, end at 5:45. That's my son's schedule. But until 4:30, it's completely Judaic studies, and Judaic studies, and then a break for lunch and prayer services. The secular studies, the academic studies, only begins for the last, hour and a bit. Unfortunately, the bar for hiring teachers is non-existent.
And it's not in English.
For the most part, not. In many of these yeshivas, it's not. So you have 10-year-olds who don't speak English. And it's kind of a vicious cycle because the teachers don't speak to them in English. The teachers are not credentialed in any way at all. There's no credentialing process. They're generally teachers of the Judaic studies in the morning, that kind of moonlight in the afternoon. So they often have not gotten any education at all, meaning they've graduated from these schools where this hour and a bit only exists for 5 years. So they're only starting this when they're about 7 or 8 and end before bar mitzvah. So it's 5 years of this really 4 to 6 hours a week being taught in Yiddish, really not getting beyond a third or fourth grade level, even that. Maybe not. And then when they go to high school, the days get longer, but there's absolutely no secular subjects at all. Again, there are some Hasidic schools that teach, some of the Haredi schools, but this is the reality for the vast majority of them. We've looked at some of the test scores, the standardized test scores that they give for, the English and math. I mean, you're looking at failing scores throughout these schools.
Is the concept of the Hasidic community, for instance, they're not looking for people to join the Hasidic community. They don't proselytize for new people, right?
Yes and no.
Oh, okay.
And the no comes because Chabad does. Proselytize amongst other Jews.
Right.
Right. If you ever,
that,
not if you're a woman, but
right.
if you're a man and you've been around, you've seen somebody say, "Are you Jewish?" And then want to put on tefillin. Or sometimes women, they'll give you candles.
And the Lubavitch?
Lubavitch is Chabad, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about is a very tight community, right?
For the most part, yes.
Yeah. And, Naftali, who was the first founder of YAFFED, said that he founded it basically because he went through 12 years of the school, and you don't graduate, right?
No, not really.
But he didn't have school to go to anymore, and he didn't want to study more, so he went to look for a job. But he knew nothing. I mean, he didn't know terminology, he didn't know the names of things. He couldn't get a job. And fortunately, he wanted to learn, and he wanted to do it, and he found a way to do it and to get into school, and then he got a degree. I think he has a master's degree. Right?
Yeah, yes.
So I just want people to understand the circumstances and how difficult the problem is.
Yeah, there are consequences on a global level, meaning citywide we see statistics show that the amount of poverty in the Hasidic community is well above any other part of the Jewish community. The only part of the Jewish community that has more poverty than the Hasidic community is, immigrants from the Soviet Union who are not eligible for any government assistance. That is the only demographic.
Why aren't they? Now you vote.
Another kind of words. I think they moved here, they never worked here, they moved here elderly. That is the only demographic that is poorer than the demographic. The rate of public assistance in the Hasidic community is higher than the rest of Brooklyn, than the rest of New York City. So there are real global implications that it has for our city as a whole.
Right.
By 2030, 30% of school children in all of Brooklyn will be Hasidic students.
Ooh.
That has implications for all of us as New Yorkers. We can't point and say, oh, it's this group, they're doing things on their own, let's let them be. No,
but they're not.
This has implications for all of us,
right.
For our economic ability to thrive and for our political world as well.
And they're very tight-knit politically. For some reason, they're a bloc.
When you don't have an education, it's really hard to understand all the nuances on the ins and outs. If you don't know how to do research because you've never...
And you can't read the English.
And you struggle with reading English, your only access to news is the news that you're being given from your community.
You don't have any.
In theory, you have choice, but you really don't.
Right. So your story reflects this.
Yeah.
Yeah?
So I'm a mother of 10.
10 children. By the time you were how old?
39, I had my youngest, but my first 8 were born. Oh, I can't believe it. My first 8 are already adults. They're all over 19, which is incredible.
But you
know.
come from the Hasidic
Yes,
community.
yes.
And you don't even come from here. I mean, you come from Toronto?
Yes. I was raised in Toronto. So I went actually to like an Orthodox Haredi school in Toronto. My education was, I would say, on the better end of things, but I did end school after 10th grade and went to a religious seminary then. So I had other catching up to do when I went to college in my mid-30s.
And where did you go to college?
I ended up going to Touro College. There's a special program in Borough Park for Hasidic women.
I've heard of that. It must be an excellent program.
I am forever grateful.
Yeah. So, but you were there with 10 children. I mean, you were living a life. Tell us about it. You don't want to tell us?
There's so much to say.
I know.
I told you, I just published an article about what it meant to leave and leave 6 children behind ultimately. Never thinking that that was going to be for always, but you know, that's how it ended up happening.
Yeah.
You know, you live in the community. That's all you know. Even though I did have exposure to some books, Anne of Green Gables, Laura Ingalls Wilder, those books.
Your family was kind of well off?
A little more. Our family was well off, yeah.
All right.
So I did have a little bit of exposure, but the reality was that everybody I knew was from the community. My parents didn't have friends that were not part of the community. If we'd go to the park and play, and then a child that was not in the community would come over and want to play with us, we'd just run away. Like, it was just so clear, you know, that there were these boundaries. Even though I grew up in a fairly mixed community, meaning I didn't grow up, you know, in Williamsburg, where my grandparents were, my cousins were. I grew up in a community where we lived on blocks with many other families, but still there were these walls that we couldn't cross. So it was just so ingrained in me from when I was a young girl. It was never about what do you want to be when you grow up. It was about, oh, you did that, great. Okay. Like, you'll make a better marriage partner.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So you were married. It was a match made for you. I mean, you didn't pick a person, right?
Yeah, that's you don't even speak to your first cousins by the time you're 10. You know, there's such deep segregation between, you know, the genders in the community, right? By 3, you're going to school completely separate, completely different lives.
So you married a rabbi.
I did, and up and coming. He was young then, right? I was 18, he was 20.
And that gave you great stature, didn't it?
It did, between the fact that my parents were wealthy and were supporting him, and he was just kind of an up and coming scholar. That definitely did. And people ask, oh, how did you feel then? I was proud. Yeah. It felt like I did what I was supposed to do.
Right.
And, you know, the concept of personal happiness or personal fulfillment, that's not really a conversation you're having when you're in the community.
And do you even think about it?
Not really.
All right.
So you keep on going, which is what I did, you know.
And you had one child and another.
Yeah, and I think back to my 20s when I had so much energy, and, you know, all my energy went to my family and my children, and, you know, being busy in the house and raising them, and that felt very good, you know. And I think years later I realized that how bad the marriage really was and how it had impacted me, but during those years I really was not in touch
there was
with
a
that.
myth of what your role is and what a marriage is like.
Yeah. I mean, you're literally taught, right?
Yeah.
Who's a good wife? Someone who listens to her husband. Like, that's your role. That's what you have to do. And he's a scholar. Literally this. How do women get reward in the world to come? By supporting their husbands in their studies and their sons in their studies, right?
Yeah.
You know.
How many girls did you have?
4 girls.
Daughters.
Yeah.
And are they all married now?
3 of my girls are married. Yeah.
How did you just decide this is not what you want? Where did you learn this?
It was a process. People always ask for that moment, right? It wasn't a moment, it was moments. And I think, you know, the first time was after my 8th child, I had a miscarriage. And I mean, this is just started feeling really depressed and bad. And for the first time in my life was kind of able to take a little space and look at what was going on around me, and just was like, something's wrong, something's wrong. And I reached out for help for the very first time. I said, I need help, I deserve help. I first went to a doctor who recommended I go to a therapist, which felt scandalous. This was 2005. That was scandalous, and nobody wanted me to go, And that was back then when there weren't therapists from the Haredi community and the Hasidic community. Now there are, which is a whole other
change.
Some positive and some negative to it. But that gave me the opportunity to start exploring, who I am, what do I want.
It's interesting.
And one of the first things I wanted to do was go to college. I hadn't graduated high school, and the idea of going to college just felt so good. I went to college. I started working part-time at a nonprofit in the community. That gave me a little bit of a voice. That gave me a little bit of my own agency, within, but still very much in the community, never imagining that I'd ever want to leave. But that led to me seeing more and more of what my marriage was really like. And did I really want to stay here? And is this where I wanted to be? Is this the life I want for myself, for my children? And ultimately, 7 years later, we're trying to make it work, putting all the work I could, but realizing that wasn't going to happen, finally making the decision to leave. Unfortunately, by that time, I was only able to take my younger children with me.
How did you know that the older children didn't want to go?
Well, they were being very vocally upset at me for working, upset at me for,
So they didn't know you were actually going to leave, did they? I mean,
well,
your husband wouldn't have been surprised.
It was not like
sudden.
It was not like a mutual. I tried to do it that way, but
work.
Unfortunately, I had to end up leaving in the middle of the night because otherwise I would have never been able to have any of the children. That was made very clear to me. Definitely, I don't recommend anybody do that. Things worked out for me, but it was quite risky.
It takes a lot of energy and a lot of knowledge.
And in retrospect, it could have gone very bad.
So now, how are we going to? What are the girls' education? I don't think we talked to it.
It's very complicated. Also, to talk about the girls' education. Generally, it's better than the boys. Generally, but it's not great. It's not great. But it's better. Meaning, it looks like a school, right? With the boys, if you walk in there, you will wonder if it's a school, right? Because you don't see the general things you usually see in a school, right? You only have that hour at the end of the day. With the girls, you generally have several more hours. The girls will speak English. But a lot of the way the girls are taught is to be able to support the men. Like, a lot of the teaching is geared to that. Back in the day, it was a lot of sewing going on, right? Nowadays, it's a lot of accounting. So you have a lot of these girls being secretaries at the beginning, things like doing that kind of work. So definitely, YAFFED looks at the girls' schools as well. And with the knowledge that with the boys, it's a lot more critical. Like with the girls in high school, they continue. Some, not many, but some Hasidic schools even give regents. That's, it's tiny proportion. But with the boys, they don't have anything at all. Nothing. Like, not even nothing. So it is definitely more.
What percentage of the boys go on to study and become rabbis or?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think it really depends on those different subsects of community. The straight Hasidic community, the vast majority of them are encouraged to eventually go to work. So they might study for a handful of years after getting married, but eventually the expectation is that they go to work. Amongst the yeshivish or Litvish community, a larger percentage of those are expected to continue learning long term, which is what my ex-husband did, and then many of my children's and their spouses are doing.
So the women, it's on the assumption that the men aren't really going to earn enough. In a way, the women are heading to support the family.
Right? And in some of that yeshivish world, you even have girls going to colleges, getting OT, speech therapy, social work. There are certain kind of acceptable fields. Oftentimes in college programs that are within kind of little cohorts within larger colleges. Some of them are a little questionable in terms of the kind of certification they get, but you have that with the idea that they'll be supporting But, they manage with a combination of the wife working, government programs, in-law supporting, and they put it all together. But it ends up being a poor community. You drive past Williamsburg before any of the holidays, and you see trucks and trucks of food for people. And I say, it's wonderful that there's so much charity, but it's charity. It's charity. There are people who need help for food for the holidays.
Something. Now tell me where you stand as far as where we are with the challenge to the state. They're trying to enforce, right, the law.
So in September 2022, the regions voted unanimously on regulations that would make the statute that's over 100 years old enforceable, right? There's a over 100-year-old statute that says that, sure, you can open a private school, but you have to make sure that what the children are being taught there is equivalent to the other schools in your district. It's reasonable, right?
Yeah.
But it was never challenged or looked at, and school districts really didn't know. So what does that mean? How do we do this?
Yeah.
So in September, they clarified exactly what the school districts need to do. That was a huge victory for YAFFED.
And how many years did it take?
I mean, YAFFED was around for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
2012 they started. Because we all knew that this was a problem in the community. Us mothers would always complain. We would always complain about the standard of education, especially for our boys. We'd be like, they're there all day, right? We send them early in the morning, put them on the bus, pick them up at night. Can't they learn something?
Yeah.
But there was no voice. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't affect change.
And the mothers didn't have a good enough education to teach them, or do they?
Well, first of all, when you have many children, sitting down and tutoring a child after he's had a 10-hour day is really not very easy. Though I will say, what we do see is there are like tutoring programs outside of the school, kind of kept on the down low secret. So what you have is the wealthier families, that have more ability to navigate, are sending their children there.
That's interesting. Yeah. Do they have any athletic programs?
No. Some of the yeshivas let them play ball so that during recess. Some of them don't even let them do that.
And so they don't really follow baseball team?
No.
Football?
No.
Anything like that?
No. That's another thing which is interesting, but really not what YAFFED works on. But there's very little cultural awareness. Till today, people talk about movies when I was a child or a teenager or a young adult. I have no idea. There was a time I was like, I'm going to catch up, and I'm going to become culturally aware, and I'm just like, whatever. Forget it.
You need your energy other
places.
Forget
it. It's just not worth it.
So now tell me, what's happening today?
So today we're actually coming close to several very important deadlines. So first of all, in 2015, Naftali Moster, the head of YAFFED, initiated a complaint against 39 different schools. It was ultimately pared down to 28 schools. A preliminary founding in 2019 found that 26 of the 28 were not substantially equivalent. Since then, it's just sat there. We couldn't get access to the records because they said it was still under investigation, but they wouldn't release a final report.
This was the Board of Education?
Yes. This was the Department of Education of New York City would not release that.
There's no more board. It used to be the Board of Education. I'm sorry.
But recently, the State Education Department ruled that they have to complete it by the end of June. So we're eagerly anticipating the results of that. Well, that was precipitated by my case, right? So years ago, before I became the executive director of YAFFED, I filed a complaint against my son's school, my youngest son. So my son needs to be in the Hasidic yeshiva that he's in because of our divorce agreement. But I tried to switch him to a different Hasidic school that gave a better education, but I was stopped. So I realized I wanted to do something. So that's when I filed a complaint. YAFFED helped me with getting a lawyer. And after 3 years, we were finally successful. We brought it in front of a judge who said, listen, this has been 3 years. Like, you guys have to complete it. Gave them 4 months to get the final results. Ultimately, the school was found to be not in compliance.
Which means then what? They don't get any fund money?
No, they give them a long time.
Okay.
They're like, put a plan, give us a plan in 60 days, get 2 years to work this through. They're giving them time, which honestly,
It's all right.
I think it's expected that a school will take time for their turnaround. I think our concern is, are they being serious about the turnaround? You know, I always say there's kind of a sentiment, YAFFED is against yeshivas, and I'm always very clear. We are pro putting education in these yeshivas. This is,
Right.
you know, this is about making sure these children get what they deserve,
Right.
making sure they get that quality of education,
Right.
so that when they graduate school, they can become an accountant easily. You know, right now you have these individuals, and they're so proud when they do it, and they should be proud when they become an accountant, when they become a lawyer, but they have to push through such hurdles. It's not fair. They should be able to get that education that they should be
Right.
able to continue on. You know, I know there's a fear that if they get more education, you know, they'll leave, but I don't think that's statistically true. You know, because you have, you know, the part of the yeshivish world that is providing an
That's
education,
interesting.
and I don't think there's a higher rate of attrition there.
That's
You know,
interesting.
so I don't think that that's true, and these children deserve it.
Could you start a yeshiva?
There have been efforts to start yeshivas. You can definitely start a yeshiva. Yeshivas start all the time. I know that there was an effort up in Rockland County to start a yeshiva. They had the principal in place, and it was all ready to go. And at the last minute, the principal got threatened that if he goes ahead with this, his children will be kicked out of the schools that they're currently enrolled in. And he was like, I'm out. So there's a lot of fear and control that comes from leadership in the community.
And could you start a college? No, you can't unless you're a member of the community, and the member of the community.
I mean, you know, the problem with college is that these children, like I was able to move right on to college, but you heard from Naftali his challenges. I know, you know, my son who's 21, he's you know, it's been a struggle for him to move on, and he has a friend who tried to get the high school equivalency, you know, enrolled in Brooklyn College. They have a program, and he went one time, and he's like, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Oh.
He's like, I need a pre-course before the course, because there's an expectation that you know a certain amount. But here are children that have never learned science, not one day, have never learned geography, have never learned history. They don't know who Martin Luther King is. They don't know what a molecule is. These are,
No, anything.
they don't know anything.
Now, I have to tell you, we've come to the end of this program, but you must promise me that once the city report comes out, you will be my guest again.
Okay.
All right?
Oh, happy to do that.
Beatrice, I just am overwhelmed.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.